Hello and welcome to this episode of the Growth Start Insights video podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be talking with Ryan, who is a security information officer, about the POPI Act and how we as an online business or normal business can implement and apply and comply to the POPI Act. Let's get into it. Good day, Ryan.
Hi, Bernard. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we are going to be talking about the POPI Act and what implications that has for your business. So, Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about what exactly the POPI Act is and what it entails?
Sure. So the POPI Act is basically an abbreviated word. It stands for the Protection of Personal Information Act. And it's basically a new act, or no, I wouldn't say new, it's actually, if I'm not mistaken, been in writing since about 2013. But from the 1st of July 2021, it will be taking into effect. And it's basically the personal information and how we utilize it within the country itself.
Okay, so I know that some of the European countries already have a similar act in place. I think it's the GDPR.
That's correct.
How does that relate? Is it similar things? Are we doing the same kind of things in our businesses that we would if we are basically applying for GDPR, or is it something totally different?
So GDPR was the forerunner. They basically, if you want to say, set the standard. They actually came about and put forward the conceptualization of the idea of protection itself. And a lot of the European unions typically follow GDPR and the privacy that surrounds that. Every country itself is coming up basically with its own standards. South Africa's got POPI. Every other country's got its own formalized version of the same thing. And they all sort of are interlinked with each other. GDPR, you would say, is the big brother and probably the most comprehensive protection act, or if you want to call it a policy that's been made. And a lot of countries typically will lean on some of the standards that are inside of there to actually formalize their own.
Okay. So now if we take a little step back and let's first define what personal information is that just like your name, your surname, ID number, or what actual information would qualify as personal information?
So for me, it all depends how far down the rabbit hole you want to go with this. Personal information you get basically personal information and special personal information. Your personal information would obviously be your name, your ID, any way that could identify you directly, whereas your special personal information might be your political views, your ethnic race, the race, your gender, things like that could identify you. For me, although again POPI is leaning towards personal information itself, I think the forerunning thing to look at would be privacy itself, in terms of actually looking at holistically everything private. But at the moment, POPI's centrally fixated on personal information. So basically any piece of information that can single you out as a person and be able to identify you, that's what POPI is there to try and protect.
So Ryan, as an example, let's take a contact form on a website. Is there anything additional that someone would have to do to make sure that content is secure? I mean, typically that would be in lines, maybe a name, surname, email address, contact number. And I think normally people would use some kind of software implication. Is it a matter of actually looking at that software specifically and seeing if that company secures that information? Or is there something that the person themselves need to do?
Well, it depends a lot on what the business does itself. I mean, if the business is a web-based business, then primarily what it does on the website itself would need to be measured. And what POPI basically asks for is that, you're identifying why you need the personal information. What tends to happen, what's happened in the past, especially with a lot of businesses, is you've gotten a lot of client information and those lists have been sold into other businesses. So those telemarketing calls, all of that stuff you get is from typically information that's been sold. So from a website perspective, there are things that you can put in place to obviously actually protect that information, but the first thing to do is to identify if you actually need that information. Once you've identified whether you need that information, then the next step would obviously then be to actually notify the data subject or the person's information that you're going to be taking that you are actually doing that. So you'll typically see it's actually because of GDPR, it's enforced more in Europe. But if you go to European sites, you'll notice a lot of pop-up banners saying, please be aware we're taking your information. Do you agree or disagree, or whatever the case is? And that's the first step, is basically just making people aware that you are recording that information. After that, then the question starts to get a bit more a bit more convoluted, because it becomes about how do you keep that information, what security do you have on, have you identified the risks surrounding it? It starts to become quite an open-ended question. So from a website perspective, the first thing is to obviously internally identify if you need that information. If you don't record it, it's less grief for you. And the second thing is to just obviously notify the data subject or the person whose information you're going to be taking, that you give them an option, or just make them aware you're going to be taking it. If they don't want you to take it, don't use the website.
So speaking about the awareness component, so I had a quick read through some basic outlines of the POPI Act, and I think there's a big theme of making the person aware. What information are we taking from you? And then also things like, actually, what are we going to use that information for? So how would somebody typically go about that? Is it before we capture the information that we need to actually do this? Or is it after we've captured the information? Or where would it actually be better to make that person aware of what we're actually doing with the information and how we're going to use it?
So typically the consent needs to be required before you take the information. Of course, there are scenarios where, especially now in contract environments where a lot of contracts already exist, and because POPI is coming into place, you would need to then send a disclaimer out to clients, making them aware that, look, even though you signed a contract 2 years ago and POPI wasn't around, we now are using your information. But it works a bit. It actually goes about giving power back to the data subject or the person or the individual, us. So we have the power to be able to first be told if our information is going to be taken, and decide if we want to have that information taken. And at the next point from there would be basically them saying to us, okay, we've got your information, this is what we're going to use it for. We can opt out of things, opt in things, and we basically got the choice. And I mean, that goes as far as to say, as an example, if you were to sign up with a network provider and they were providing you with a service, if they were then to phone you for marketing, you could request for your name to be removed off a marketing list, so that they would actually, it's up to the provider, or in this case, the network operator, to make a note of that removal of service from you, and they can no longer contact you on that block. Obviously, there's certain caveats. So you can't, for instance, be on an SLA type scenario, as an example, where you need feedback if systems go down and ask to be completely removed from their systems, because then how do they let you know things are offline? But from a marketing standpoint and all of that, one thing you'll notice, I've been experiencing it, is that the phone adverts that you get when people call you, it's actually ramped up a bit now, and you'll probably see from the 1st of July that's going to taper off a lot. It's more, like I said, geared towards the person being able to ask the questions, but it is a requirement for the business to pose that question first before taking the information, especially if it's a new contract, or at least from the 1st of July it'll be a requirement for anything new.
Okay, so let's say we've got an existing business, right? And we've got a marketing list or database of, some of our leads or existing clients and so on. You spoke earlier about sending out an email and just making sure that these people do know how we're using their information. And should we also again ask for consent? Or as they're on our list already, does that mean they've actually given us consent? Or should we just, as a precaution, send out an email or send out some form of communication just to reaffirm that consent and awareness?
So it goes back to the old, it's not the greatest adage, but there's many ways to skin a cat. There's many ways to go about doing this. Personally, one of the things that I'm sort of leaning more towards as a blanket methodology. So in terms of a terms and conditions policy, or something that basically will talk about terms and conditions holistically for the business itself. You would notice, for instance, with some of the big providers like Google's and Microsoft's, when there is a change in terms of service or terms and conditions, there isn't a case of them giving you a new contract for you to sign. It's more a case of it letting you know about it, going and reading it. And usually there's a period that you can obviously flag and say, I'm not happy with this, that they give you after that terms and condition has come out. Thereafter, it's the new terms and conditions. So for me, the easiest thing to do is would be to probably review your terms and conditions you've got, adding a segment in that around Poppy. And unfortunately, because I say a segment, add a comprehensive thing around Poppy and how you handle it. And from there, because Poppy is flavor of the moment, probably any emails you send out in the next bit, maybe just have a little small caveat that mentions that you guys are looking at Poppy, and if you want to know more, go look at our terms and conditions, or terms of service. But basically, that would be my suggestion: updating your terms of service, sending out to your clients saying, look, our services have changed and these are the requirements, and they've got a period to obviously flag or escalate. Thereafter, that becomes the lay of the land, or the lay of the company.
Okay, I'm just thinking in my head, and I'm trying to break down, in a simpler form, the Poppy Act. So, if I would break it down, I think the first thing is consent, making sure that we've got that permission. The second thing would be awareness. Making sure that the person is aware of where this data is being kept, how we're going to be using it. And then the third would be going around the actual privacy. How are we going to make sure that this information is kept with us and not going into anybody else's hands? And then the fourth part I would say is probably the security aspect. Again, how do we actually secure this and make sure it doesn't get leaked? We see so many things online of data leaks, and it's got huge implications for people. So would you add anything to that, or do you think those four pretty much cover it?
So there are a lot of articles out there. There's a lot of legal firms who also go into it. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but again, a lot of it does work with logic. Typically, the Poppy itself works with 6 points. You've mentioned a few of them, but they are out there and they are stated. So, I'll just touch on them briefly. So the first point is much like you said, it's the consent. So you're looking, that the individual is giving clear consent for you to process this information. The second would be contract. So the processing is necessary for a contract you have with the individual. So you're checking to make sure that is valid. The third thing is legal obligation. So you're checking that the processing is necessary for you to comply with the law. So obviously you don't want to process something that's outside of legal requirements. The fourth thing would be vital interest. So that's the processing necessary to protect someone's life. So as an example, vital interest would be COVID. That would be seen as information where you are taking someone's name, their temperature. That would be vital interest, because that's protecting people's lives and keeping that information. From there would be the public task. That's basically processing necessary to perform tasks in public interest, or for an official function. And then the last thing is the legitimate interest. So that's the processing data necessary for you to legitimately, do what you need to do for your business and potentially give to third parties. So as an example, a lot of the time, I'll give an example. If, for instance, you were to go to a retailer and purchase something on credit, your acquiring bank, whatever you want to call it, would then need to actually check your credentials against the credit regulator to make sure that you're in good standing. And basically from there, that would be you passing your information on to that person. So you would need to make sure that when you're passing that information on, you're passing it on to somebody who complies and is going to look after that information, because they become a responsible party of that.
Okay. Now, would you say that it affects small businesses the same as it would larger enterprises? Is there any difference in terms of the implementation of it? Or is it pretty much the same, across the board?
So the process and the mindset is the same. I think obviously the bigger the company, the harder it is to enforce because you have more people and you've got to have more rules and you've got to get that buy-in from management. Again, it's a law, so there can't be too much buy-in. It has to happen. But obviously the bigger the company it is, the harder it is to put in place, just because you actually, one of the primary things to understand with Poppy is, first of all, what you do. I mean, you can't manage what you don't know. So at the end of the day, you need to understand what you do as a company. Once you understand that, then you need to start saying, right, we've got all of these activities, this is what we do, and you need to basically cross-reference those activities with the data flow. Do we actually keep information? What is that information? So that you can better understand. And I think that's actually the primary push from the regulator itself, is to basically make sure that you're going in there and performing a gap analysis or risk assessment on what you do, so that you understand what you're doing with that information, as opposed to just sort of, avoiding the risk altogether and saying, well, we're not really worried about it.
Sure. And I mean, from if I'm a sole proprietor or a big corporation, we all need to comply, right?
Yes, yeah, no, as far as I understand, I've watched a few seminars around this, and I mean, they've said it goes from big companies through to it's a bit silly, but it goes to your fruit vendor on the side of the road. So it's across the board. I mean, every company has theoretically got an information officer, but the onus for the implementation of this falls on the top of the hierarchy. So the MD or the chief officer, whoever's in charge at the company, that's who it falls onto, unless obviously they've put an information officer in place. So obviously it becomes a bit of a difficult thing from a company perspective, because obviously bigger companies might have the ability to put people into this position to specifically look after data and be able to look at this, whereas obviously in a smaller company, typically people form multiple roles within that company. So it's challenging, because you'd be doing what you do and then having to do all of this information checking on the side as well. So it gets challenging for the small companies, but I think it's easier to implement because there's less traffic. Obviously depending, because I mean, look, obviously, especially with software and development teams nowadays, you can have a small 5-man team that's making multi-million rands and, bigger teams that are making less. So it's also very difficult to say, oh, well, smaller companies or smaller teams don't need as much protection, or it's easier to implement. I think you just have to understand what you do. And once you know that, you can make a better judgment call.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that makes sense. I'm just thinking, we from a digital perspective, if you're using for your website as an example, something like WordPress, a lot of the software already has that GDPR component built into it. So if you would comply to GDPR and you've switched all these things that's integrated to that software on already, does that mean specifically that you are compliant to Poppy? Or is there anything additional that you would need to do?
Theoretically speaking, if you cover yourself with GDPR, you should cover yourself with Poppy. What a lot of people need to realize, with, again, the way I've been made to understand this, is with because each country has got its own form of protection in place. Like I said, typically, as far as I understand, the European Union is using GDPR. Holistically, they're all using it. But typically, depending on the breach of information, you can be contacted by that regulator itself. So, just because, as an example, if you've got a client list that's got people from America, Europe, and South Africa, and that gets leaked, in essence, you could be contacted by each regulator of their country to come and question you as to what's going on. So GDPR would be the best to stick with, because typically it's the top-notch one. But there is a lot of overlap between the different acts themselves. So, I wouldn't necessarily say if you do one, you do the other, but if you're trying to centrifugally focus around GDPR, you should in essence cover yourself for Poppy in South Africa. But there are also some comparative guides that are out there. I've actually found a few myself that discuss the similarities between GDPR and Poppy. I think we do, as typical South Africans, we have a bit of a different wording on a few of the things, just because we've decided we can. But in essence, it's pretty much the same. I think it's a little bit more stricter with GDPR than Poppy, but it's much for a muchness.
Okay. So if you're dealing with international people, you capture any kind of international, especially European information, definitely be GDPR compliant.
Yeah. No, look, I can't speak for GDPR certification, but another thing a lot of people fall into the trap of at the moment is there's a lot of fly-by-nights going on at the moment, in line with POPI, and as far as I can see, there's no certification from the regulator itself. So there's nothing that, for instance, you could do that would say you are now certified, everything's 100%. It's still very new. I mean, it's only, as I said, coming into effect and fully running from the 1st of July. So I reckon, within the next year, we'll start seeing some more formality around it, and you will start to slowly see more standardizing and things like that. I mean, the big thing to bear in mind here is that, there's a lot of standards that exist out there, and unfortunately, because there's no real standard with privacy just yet, there isn't really any right or wrong. But again, with time, you'll start to see, I believe you'll start to see the privacy acts for those countries aligning to specific standards like ISO or NIST or whatever's out there.
So you were speaking earlier, Ryan, about big corporations normally have the resources to actually commit someone to that position of information security and so on, where the smaller person doesn't necessarily have those resources. So is this something that a person could do by themselves? Is it a small business and they can handle it internally? Or should we go look for a consulting firm or somebody that can do that? Should we contact a lawyer? What is the best way forward for a person to comply? Should we get that external help, or is it something that we can actually do internally?
So you could perform it internally, but one of the biggest questions, one of the things you need to ask yourself is, do you know what you're looking for? Obviously, if you've got expertise and you've worked in a compliance background, or you've worked in a quality field, or auditing and things like that, I wouldn't necessarily say that you're 100% going to be, able to sort it out yourself, but it puts you in that mindset to ask the right questions. Typically, and it depends if a lot of clients can obviously afford this. A lot of people will, for instance, go to a consultant, just because, again, those consultants are working in the area and they're better tasked with being able to give you the information that you need and to get you in line with that. You can perform it yourself and try, but the one thing just to warn everyone is that it's not a paper pushing exercise. It's not a certificate you put on the wall that says we've got POPI, we're good to go, or a checklist. A lot of it is introspection and seeing what you've got and being able to do gap analysis to understand what those are and how to fill those gaps. And if you don't know the right question to ask, you might miss asking the question entirely and think you're sorted when you aren't. So even I would safely assume there's no harm bringing third parties in to come and help, just to give you another angle to try and answer those questions for you.
Sure. Now we've spoken about from a digital perspective, making sure that the software that you use, all those things are compliant, using whatever is already compliant to GDPR and so on. But as for an actual physical document point of view, so I've got a little notepad and I'm writing down somebody's personal details. How would we apply POPI in that aspect?
So again, that would come down to be understanding what you're doing with that information. So what you need to be able to do, what the regulator would want to see is, again, if you're recording that information, why are you recording it? Do you need that information? Once you've ascertained the viability of it, and if you need that information, the next step would be, how do you look after it? Now, there's certain things you can look at. So I mean, if you're keeping it on your laptop, obviously there's a lot of risk involved with that, because is your laptop at home? Are you moving it around? What security do you have at home? I mean, do you have, if you're in a home business, do you have firewalls? Do you have, basic IS security in place? So there's all those questions. Well, the easiest thing, or the cop out for me, that a lot of people are going to is moving more towards a cloud-based solution, primarily because your hosting providers like Google and Amazon and Microsoft are typically compliant to GDPR, which typically means they cover that, and to quite a few ISOs. So if you were to keep that information, you would keep it on their cloud. That would sort of mitigate some of that responsibility from you and not necessarily pass the buck, but because again they are specializing in it, sort of cover you from that element. So you'd first want to identify if you need the information, and then from there obviously you need to identify the security you have around that. Now, depending on your company, usually the suggestion would be to go to a security specialist or a company that can help you from a digital standpoint, that can walk you through that and try to put those systems in place. I say a cheaper option, it's not necessarily a cheaper option, or a better one might be moving to a cloud solution or something along those lines, just to at least cover that documented information. Remember, there's a lot of things that play into it. A lot of people will typically look at POPI and say, well, personal information relates to a client coming to me. It does, yes, but at the same time, depending on your company size, if you've got HR's got all your employees' information. That's personal information. So you're not just looking at external, you're looking internally as well. So you've got to make sure not only are your internal systems are kept safe, but your external and how you go about things. So, I've had people ask me, can we come in and check that IT's, POPI compliant? Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily mean because IT is POPI compliant, the whole company is. The one thing to bear in mind is that IT or IS, or however you want to layer it, typically is in charge of how that information is spread throughout the organization. However, each unit or each element inside the business is responsible with how they look after that information, and that's what you need to make sure of. Again, is your marketing department doing all it can? Is your sales department doing all it can? Operations, so on and so on. And that's why there's a bit of confusion between this, whether this is an IT or an IS requirement, or if it's the whole company. And it's the whole company. It's basically how you holistically look after data.
So let's talk about internally within a company, right? So we were saying about the HR department obviously having the employees' details. What is the responsibility of that internal department? Let's use the HR department as an example. Can the HR department share that personal information with maybe the marketing department, or the marketing department share it with the IT department?
So internal to the company, obviously, depending on privilege, I mean, your HR is not going to share payslips with other employees. I mean, that won't happen. So there's confidentiality tied behind it. But typically, this is what your information officer would be doing within your company itself. They would be tasked with going into each of these departments, performing these assessments, and understanding how this information is spread between each of the areas of the business. Are they needed? Is it necessary? I mean, as an example, if you've got a shared server that everybody has access to and you're keeping HR information there, well, that's a problem. So now, do you need to segregate that, move it somewhere else? Yes, because then you are making sure only the right people have access. It can start going into data classification. So you're saying, okay, well, we classify information as being top secret because it's ExCo or higher up in the company, higher management. So lower down don't need to know. Your data classification goes even further because the one thing a lot of people forget about is data destruction. So, the information you've got, are you archiving and destroying it, or are you simply just keeping it on a flash drive or on a hard drive forever? Well, again, POPI says only keep the information you need. So now you've got to start saying, okay, well, now we're going to destroy data after a year. We destroy everything. Well, now hang on. Finance requires that you keep information for anywhere 3 to 7 years, depending on what the requirement is. You might have a contract with a client that says we've got to keep information for 10 years, and that's where all of this assessment needs to come in. It's not just a quick cut thing where you can say, well, we understand, we can't have information, so we just delete it after a year. The regulator or whoever would come in and audit you would say, well, how have you done that assessment? How do you know? Do you keep financial records? That needs to be kept for this long. So it starts to become quite an intricate thing, and that's why a lot of companies don't necessarily perform this on their own, because it's not that they don't necessarily or can't do it. It's just the insight to do it and the questions that need to be asked. Like I said, there's a difference between asking questions and asking the right questions, and that's typically what your consultants will do. And what they strive to do is go out there, see what you do, and basically try and tighten you up as much as possible.
So if you had to guide someone on implementing POPI in the business, whether it be a small business or large enterprise, you said the first thing to do obviously is the gap analysis, looking at what data you actually do need to capture, and then working from there. What would you say are the steps involved there?
So it depends a lot on the business, size, all of that. One of the first things that I would typically do is be able to do try to implement like a RACI model, so a responsibilities, accountabilities, consulting formed, where you can identify all the activities within your organization or department, and identify if those activities then have a POPI impact or a personal information impact, or be able to classify if that information or data is privacy related or whatever the case is. So that would be the first thing to do, I think, would be to, again, you can't manage what you don't know. So understanding what you do as an organization, layering that out, and from there, once you've got those activities, identifying if there is a POPI impact. Once you've got that identified, then the next step would obviously be to start understanding each of those activities and the relevance of them. I mean, if you've got activity where, for whatever reason, you're printing out client names and putting them on a whiteboard, do you need to do that? So it would then be trying to identify if those activities are relevant. Is there a better way of doing them? And again, this is why typically you'd have an information officer who would be looking at it from that side. The one thing to think about is most companies, again, it depends on what you can afford to implement, but when you implement a quality management department, typically you will have compliance officers who will work in safety compliance, environmental health, whatever it is. They basically check the laws, and this is where the information officer comes in. His sole task is to check and make sure that the information within the company, internal and external has been identified, basically checked to make sure it's safe, or that systems are in place to look after it, and then be able to document all of that to show if, for instance, there's an audit or something like that happens.
Sure. So I think for a smaller business, whoever is going to, in that little business, be tasked with that duty of making, being the information officer, to firstly obviously do that gap analysis. And I think the best course of action there is maybe to eliminate any unnecessary data and any unnecessary risk. You were having the example of writing names on a whiteboard. Don't do that at all. Make sure that whatever software you're using or whatever tools that you're using are already compliant. It just makes that whole process a little bit easier.
Yeah, and I'd even go as far as to say, once you've done all that, depending on where you are, get a third party in to come and check. I mean, it's very hard to sit and it's the same as if I write something out, business case or whatever the thing is. If I write something out, you kind of get clouded and stuck with the wording that you've typed out, and bringing somebody in to help you can obviously show you things that you might have missed, add elements in that you may not have even identified. And I think it's good, once you've got that in place, not to simply say, okay, good, we're sorted out. Go look for that third party to come in. Remember, if you're bringing somebody in to build a system, it's going to be a lot more expensive for you than if you've tried to implement a system and they come in and try and aid you. I mean, the time spent is going to be a hang of a lot less, because you're looking at, a couple of hours as an example to go over what you've got, as opposed to sitting a couple of hours just to try and implement and then go over. So do as much as you can, learn as much as you can, and then I would still suggest going to a consultant to try and get that information. Don't just think that you sort of covered yourself, because the big thing to remember about all of this is, again, there are legal implications with it. So, the penalties for POPI, as far as I'm aware, and the Cybercrimes Act has now come out. And I mean, the Cybercrimes Act tied in with POPI and how we use information. I mean, half of the stuff that's going on there is talking about offences going to prison for, anywhere from 1 to 10 years, or up to 10 million rand fine. Or a combination of both, or if there's multiple parties that have had breaches, amounts split between everyone. So now you're starting to talk legal, and it's starting to get a little bit more muddier, and it's not just a nicety to have, it's a legal requirement. Yeah. So I think just for peace of mind and just to make sure that you're in the right space, do what you can, and then go to that third party to try and get that confidence, and know that what you're putting in is right.
Now, that definitely makes sense, Ryan. Now, what I'm thinking about is, right, so you're going to do as much as you can internally. do the gap analysis, look what information you can eliminate, look at how you can secure all of this. But then who do we go to? Who do we actually, you were saying there was no certification, or there's no, certification from the regulator. So how do we know that the external company or the consultant that we're using is actually up to par when it comes to POPI?
So there's things that you need to look out for. There's a few things. So the one thing I would say is check what that company does, how long they've been around for, and what they specialize in. What I've typically seen is there are companies out there, for instance, that are doing PCI, which is the payment card industry, and there's a bunch of standards set out there. And to be honest, that's actually probably where it first started, was in the payment card sector, where there was identification of personal information and how do we look after it. And, GDPR and the rest of the country world caught up many years after that to identify, well, it's not just payment card information, it's, Facebook, etc., etc. But, as an example, people who are doing PCI compliance, there is overlap between standards. So as an example, between PCI and ISO and NIST, there's overlap. There are certain policies and requirements that are available one and the other. So if you're going to somebody, check to see what sort of compliance they offer and how long they've been doing it for. If it's we simply just offer POPI and that's all we've done, well, POPI's only been around and people have only started taking it seriously in the last couple of years. So taking somebody like that as opposed to maybe somebody who's been doing PCI for the last 8 years, I'd rather take the PCI guy. The main thing that I would say that you should also look at for me is ISO. So if you actually look at Microsoft and Amazon Amazon and Google, you'll notice that there's certain standards, and that's actually where I'm towards. Is there's an ISO called ISO 27001, which is for a information security management system, which identifies how you look after your management system. And then if you have a look, there's actually an ISO 27701, and that speaks more to privacy and how you look after personal information, which again is a caveat of privacy. And if you go and look, you'll see a lot of websites that Microsoft and Google and Amazon have put out on their website, where they say we are certified in this. And there's been conversation around if GDPR is actually going to formally use ISO 27701 as its framework to build your system. So I would go to companies and check what compliance they have in place, and make sure that they have some of these names behind them, whether it's a NIST or again an ISO or a PCI. Those are the foundations to know that you're going to a company that's been doing it. And again, years experience is very important here. I mean, again, fly-by-nights are going to start showing up all over the place, and again, they're going to offer you a pack of documents with what they deem to be the correct information. And from my standpoint, that's not the correct way to get somebody ready. To get somebody ready, you can provide them with documents, but you want to take them through and understanding what's going on. And again, like I've said, the right questions to ask, not sort of, punt over all the information and say, there it is, and then they can put a certificate on the wall. Unfortunately, POPI's going to be one of these continual improvements systems. So you're going to have to continually improve it. And unfortunately, you've got to understand what that means. And, you've got to make sure you're going somewhere that's going to give you that information.
Yeah, so I think just very important to actually do your, due diligence and make sure that you're dealing with a reputable place if you're going to get a consultant or lawyer or whomever it is on board. But I think, giving some advice, the first thing is to, just do internally as much as you can. Then go and get that second opinion to make sure, that you've actually got the right things in place.
Yeah.
POPI is an ongoing thing, obviously. It's not just something that you're going to do once off and be compliant and then you can forget about it. What processes can somebody implement in whatever business they have to make sure that ongoing that they're going to stay compliant?
So the biggest thing with again, there's lots of standards out there, and one of the fundamentals of any sort of system you're putting in place is buy-in from the top. So you need your higher management, your exco, to be driving this. This needs to be a cultural change and something that's enforced from the top. Something where your MDs and your high ups are coming and saying, "Look, guys, we need to get this done." you can't really enforce this from the bottom. It's going to be difficult to try and put it in place. And like I said, what a lot of people need to realize, especially with Poppy, is its legal requirements. So if you don't have an information officer as the MD, you are the sole custodian for driving this within the business. And if something goes wrong, the finger is going to be pointed at you. So you need to make sure that, you understand what the requirements are and that you are reviewing things. I think that's one of the big things that a lot of people forget about is you put a lot of documentation in place, but how often are we checking that this documentation is still relevant? I mean, we could have something in from the 90s or 80s. I mean, computers they were around, but not as prominent as now, or as easy to use as now. And is what's inside of your policy relevant? Has that policy been melded towards your business? And I mean, it starts going a bit more in depth where if, for instance, you say, okay, well, we've got an incident response policy, and the idea is we identify when there's an incident, we have to do this, this, and this. One of the questions that'll be asked is, well, great. As an example, in a business, if you've got fire drills that have to be run to make sure that everyone knows what to do when there's a fire incident, or there's a man down, someone's had a heart attack, or medical, or whatever the case is. Do you perform those trial or dry runs, or whatever you want to call them, in line with your incident response policy? So there's a lot of things that are very interlinked and interconnected. And as I said, it's not a case of just putting something in and leaving it there like a fire extinguisher. You can't just buy a fire extinguisher, put it there, and leave it for 10 years. You've got to check it. I mean, I don't know what the requirements are, but if it's yearly, there's a certain requirement and a legal requirement on how often you have to check that. And it's the same in line with this. I mean, from a documentation perspective, how regularly are your documents being assessed? Are you running trials? Are you checking to make sure that what you've got is relevant, or can policies be removed? That's kind of what they want to see, is that you're going through those exercises.
Yeah, I think it's the same with everything else. It's a continual process of improvement. I think the big thing, as always, is just to make a start. Try again, implement it yourself, or whoever's going to have that responsibility. But start doing it internally first. Then get that second opinion, and make sure that it's an ongoing process, that it's always in mind. And how, when your technology changes, or your software that you use changes, or whatever tools that you're using, or if you've got a different business process that's starting out, everything just needs to be checked, and you constantly need to go back and review and make sure that those things are still adequate enough. I think briefly.
I think just to add to that, sorry, another thing that a lot of companies don't take into consideration is every activity you're doing should be documented. And I think what's very important is to identify, if someone is going to be in charge of a task, make them the custodian to do the documentation as well. A lot of the time you have a lot of people who are sent out to do the physical aspect of a job, whatever that might be. There's got to be paperwork. I mean, one of the 4 keywords that I learned is, at the end of the day, you've got to say what you do what you say, provide evidence to show that, and then be able to show there's continual improvement. If you can do those 4 things, then you should be fine. And you need to be able to do them for all your activities, because, if I walk in somewhere and you tell me that you keep minutes from meetings for 3 months, and I ask you for 2 months ago and you don't have it, well, how can I trust that anything in your organization runs correctly if you're not following your own rules? I'm not even talking Poppy now. These are rules you set for yourself. So it's very important to make sure you've got that. And why it's important is because people need to know where the lines are. They need to know what the requirements are. So at the end of the day, if it's not company policy to keep information on a laptop, that needs to be put out there, because somebody can come back and say, well, I didn't know. So if I didn't know, how could I have done it better? And that's sort of what you want to gear for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great thing to mention again is the documentation part, as you mentioned. The first thing that a regulator will come and do if they do audit you is say, well, where's the proof? Show us how you actually implemented this, and that you actually did try to prevent it. In the case of a breach or whatever happens, that's the first thing that's probably going to happen. So I think, Ryan, let's just go briefly through a quick step implementation guide if you'd have to give advice to any business. Just what are the first couple of things that they need to do?
So I think the first thing is to go. I would say first of all, give somebody, depending on the size of your organization, give somebody the responsibility to actually, drive this within the organization. If it's the MD, that's great. If you have capacity for information officer, that's great. And then what you want to do is make sure that that person goes and does the reading up and the checking and the understanding of what actually needs to happen. And it's company specific, but if it's a monthly or a 6 monthly, whatever the need is, have sessions around how you're going to go about implementing the system. When we talk implementation, again, the first thing to identify is understand what everybody does within the business, and how they do that. Now, that doesn't mean the information officer must go and start saying, well, this person does this and this is the activities. It's the best people who know what they do are the people who do that. So as the information officer, it's about going into a certain area of the business. As an example, if it's big enough, operations, they should know what they do. So again, from the top management, the information officers give empowered to speak to that operations manager and say, hey, can you please, we need to sit together, identify what's going on, have those sessions where you can show that he's basically taking operations through understanding, what those activities are, the data flow. So seeing if that information is going out, seeing if it can be done better. Once you've got all of that information, you could then pretty much do a risk-based analysis or gap analysis to say, look, we've identified this is everything we do. There's better ways to do it. And it depends on what kind of risk analysis you want to use. A lot of them use like a calculation tool where you can put some risks higher and other risks lower and determine what you want to hit first. It can depend on financials and all sorts of things, but that's also sort of the way you want to go about it. I mean, you must understand, you can't necessarily do everything and be the best at everything, unfortunately. I mean, as an example, if you're running a business, you can't have the best safety in the country and then have the cheapest prices. It won't work. You're probably spending a lot of money to have safety, and it's the same as this. You can't spend a ton of money on all of these wonderful technologies and expect the company to turn big profits because you're spending. So you've got to balance out and see what works for you. Remember, the biggest thing is identifiable risk, being able to see the risk and then make a judgment call. It doesn't necessarily mean because you've got a risk it's going to cost 5 million rand and you've got a 100,000 rand company, you have to do that. You can say, look, we've seen this risk, we identify we cannot close the gap, but we're trying to put these things in place. Well, you're trying, and that's what they want. They want to see that you've had that thing. They don't want to walk into your business and say, what do you do here? Well, we do this, okay, and are you doing it the best you can? Yeah. Where have you got proof? Have you got some sort of analysis that you've tested to see, is there better ways you could have done it? If you don't have that, they're going to know you haven't even bothered, and that's typically who they're going to come down on, like a pile of bricks.
Yeah, I think it's very important to remember that. I think it's it's taking effect 1st of July. So firstly, make sure that you familiarize yourself with what everything entails, and then make sure that you've taken active steps toward that. I am assuming that there will be some, leniency, especially at, the first couple of months while people are still getting the hang of it. You're not going to get that 10-year prison fine, right, on the 2nd of July.
Well, look, it depends a lot on what the infringement is and what's happened.
Absolutely.
I mean, I saw a comment the other day, and the guy said, they're going to have to build a hang of a lot more prisons because of all the new laws that are coming in. I suspect there's going to be more fines. I've had a lot of people saying to me, well, how do you think that they're going to do this and run it? And like I've said, at the end of the day, there's money involved and there's government involved. I mean, if they can make a few rand here and there, they're going to jump on that bandwagon. I think that's something that you just need to bear in mind when you're trying to implement the system is from the 1st of July, it is in effect. They aren't necessarily going to jump on people straight away. They're probably going to target, I would assume, bigger companies just because they can. But it's probably going to take anywhere, I would say, I would fathom a guess at about a year. Once we get some cases that have gone through and some precedents that's been set, that we can start, aligning and saying, well, this is what happened here, so this is the outcome here. Primarily, the majority of it will, I reckon, be fine-based more than imprisonment-based. Yeah. But again, you're going to have that leniency primarily because there is a lot of there are a few conflicting things that leave a lot of people confused. I've had people asking me, they say, well, in this situation, how do we do it if this is happening? And I don't have an answer for them because, again, it's still too new in the country for us to be able to say, this is what you have to do. I think it's the information regulators at a point where they're just like, we need to now bring this in. It's actually already in effect. It's only from the first that you're going to start being held to what you say. It's just worth people realizing that don't also take the mindset that you need to be breached before you do something. Sure. I would be very surprised if the regulator doesn't perform random audits on companies just to confirm that they are actually compliant as well. So the best thing would rather be proactive than reactive in this stage.
Yeah, no, well said. I think the best thing is being prepared, making sure that before the 1st of July, you've already taken some steps towards making sure that you're compliant. And then if anybody does come and audit you, or, you have some kind of breach, hopefully not, but if you do, that you have some kind of proof to show that you've taken some kind of steps. And then also, I think for the regulator as well, it's going to be an ongoing process. They also don't know yet what kind of cases they're going to deal with and what the, kind of response to those cases is going to be. It's all going to happen as it happens, and I think we're all going to learn. But the biggest thing is just to make sure that you've taken some kind of steps and you are prepared. You don't want to be caught, like you mentioned, with a breach and then you've done nothing about it. So definitely, be prepared.
And also it might not even be a breach. Like I said, it might be a scenario where they just knock on your door and say, "Hi, we want to see what's going on," and you're not prepared. So
yeah. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. I think we've been chatting for almost an hour now. I think your information has really been helpful. I think there's a lot of people that are going to get benefit from it. And if anybody has any questions, pop them in the comments below, and I'm sure Ryan will be happy to give his professional input there and try and answer them for us. Ryan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Great, thanks. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks, man. Okay,
cheers.
Cheers, bye.
All right.